For Medskl.com, I'm Dr. Sanjay Sharma, and welcome to If I Knew Then, a show that's really based on a simple premise. When everything is said and done, life comes down to a few key moments and decisions. On today's show, we're thrilled to have Dr. Robert Pearl. He's a professor at Stanford School of Medicine. He's a best-selling author. He's a physician leader, having led over 10,000 physicians with Permanente's medical group, and he's been named one of modern healthcare's 50 most influential physicians. Welcome to the show, Dr. Pearl. We're thrilled to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sanjay.
Great. So, it's a phenomenal resume, but I'm always intrigued how people start off. So why don't you just take us back to the very beginning? Where did you grow up? Tell us a few of the key influences that really drove you into the world of medicine.
I grew up just outside of New York, New York City and Long Island, and I went to college at Tufts, and I went there to become a college professor. And I think one of the first lessons for all the students listening to your program is how serendipity plays such a role in where we ultimately go across our careers. I went there to be, a philosophy major,
Wow.
a philosophy professor, and my hero didn't get tenure. And he didn't get tenure not because he wasn't good. He became the chairman at Reed, but he didn't get it because of his political views. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting, someone who was CEO in Kaiser Permanente, someone who spends a huge amount of time in the Affordable Care Act in Washington, D.C., I decided I didn't want any part of politics. That's why I actually went into medicine, as crazy as that sounds, and decided that would be my career, something that would be very honest, very straightforward. So that's how I chose to become a physician. I took a bunch of science classes. I had placed out of some AP classes coming out of high school.
Okay.
And then I went from there to Yale Medical School.
Now, just sort of growing up, I mean, you talked about philosophy, but were you science-driven or, kind of creative, artistic, or kind of a mix of both?
I think it was a mix of everything. I've always enjoyed creativity. If you'll see across my career, I think that's actually what I do. Whether I was a practicing plastic surgeon, creative in the operating room, as the CEO, reshaping Kaiser Permanente, redefining its strategy, coming up with something that was completely different. In fact, I talk in my book, Mistreated, Why We Think We're Getting Good Healthcare While Usually Wrong, about the fact that I didn't necessarily want to be CEO. You'd think that everyone would want to be CEO of a company. But in medicine, as you well know, it's not necessarily that well respected. And in my particular organization, a non-for-profit, didn't pay very much more, but it was ultimately the creativity of the experience that drove me to want to do it. So I think I had both sides, the philosophic and the scientific. I programmed computers in the summer to earn money.
Wow.
But I spent a lot of my time outside of that, pursuing a variety of more creative, semi-artistic approaches.
Wow, that's very interesting. So let's hone in on your medical school experience. So tell me a little bit about that. Was it just essentially a traditional experience, or did you take time off to indulge some of these other passions that you had, or just kind of walk us through that?
No, Yale Medical School at the time was unique in that it had no grades and no exams.
Wow. I'm sure a lot of students would wish that's the way it is now.
Well, it's actually a very interesting balance because you still have to obviously learn the material. It's not like getting a check box on your resume. Mm-hmm. You actually have to learn how to take care of patients. So that was I'll say both one of the challenges and one of the major positive experiences that I carried on to the rest of my life. You had to do two things. You had to write a thesis, and you had to pass what's called step 1, step 2 these days. So the first issue was, how would I study? And this is where I developed, I think, a lot of habit. I would always have certain times of the day that I'd go to the library. It's just like it was a class or a job. And in that way, there was a method, in a sense, to each of the days, a structure around it. When I went to write the book, Mistreated, I would always write from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. to midnight. And it became a habit. I'm a runner. I run every morning. Not sometimes, not other times. I mean, sometimes I'm flying, but if I can, I always run at a particular time. So building those habits, I think, came out of that particular experience at Yale. And I also had the chance to run a psychiatric halfway house when I was a resident.
Wow.
As that sounds, I am a surgeon, but interestingly enough, the second most common choice of specialties for surgeons is psychiatry, and vice versa.
It's funny you say that, because one of the things that I definitely was interested in, if I didn't become an ophthalmologist and retina specialist, was psychiatry. So I think there is something to that for sure.
So it was a very full experience. And I said, that's where the psychiatric side, the creative side, the artistic side, something a little different than just the scientific. And yet I also had to make sure that I mastered all the subjects and had the information I needed ultimately for my residency.
And I just want to pick up on that issue of habits for the medical students and university students who are listening, because I think that's so critical. And I too am an early riser and structure a lot of deep thinking, planning, reviewing stuff from that 5 to 7 a.m. slot. And I just think there's something the way that we're wired that is really peak time to be planning your days. And I'm a huge fan of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and your quadrant 2 thinking for the day is critically done during that time period, I think. So why don't you walk me through the decision to go into plastic surgery? What was some of the thinking, what was going through your mind as you were a senior medical student making that decision?
Well, I didn't make that decision.
Okay.
I actually made a different decision.
Okay.
Remember, I'm coming out of an experience where I want to avoid politics at all costs. And today, if you do cardiac surgery, your mortality is 1 or 2%. But at the time, it was about 10%.
Wow.
And I decided that I'd become a heart surgeon because it never would bother me if I wasn't any good. I mean, not that I would like to be not any good, but I would accept that. But what would be something that I couldn't accept would be being good and then having someone else move ahead of me, just the person that I am. And I figured that cardiac surgery would be the one specialty where if you're good, people would know it. And if not, you better accept it and deal with it. So I actually went to Stanford to train in cardiovascular surgery.
Wow.
And I again was disillusioned. And I was disillusioned because the surgeon who I thought, again, was the best surgeon I had seen, didn't get all of the referrals, didn't get all of the glamour. Why was that? Because he didn't belong to the right country club. Because he wasn't the name guy. He was just a great doctor. And so again, I'm disillusioned again. And I do my rotation on plastic surgery, something that at the time I knew nothing about. I actually figured it was all cosmetic surgery. And I loved it again. I loved the anatomy of hand surgery, head and neck cancer. And then the chairman of the department must have seen some potential. He said, how would you like to go to Mexico for a month and do cleft lip and cleft palate?
Wow.
And that was the turning point experience. I went to Mexico. I did surgery there. I loved it. There was something about being able to see the smile on the parent's face, or if it was an adult on the individual's face. And that's when I made the decision to become a plastic surgeon. And fortunately, an opening in the program arose. I was asked to take it, and I transferred over from cardiac into plastic surgery.
Interesting.
Serendipity again. Second time in my life.
Yeah. It's so it seems like, I mean, we started off the conversation talking about philosophy, and that's what pulled you into university. It seems to me like you're just open to possibilities. Is that fair to say, in terms of, like, there's some people who are very strategic, and then some people who are, experiential in terms of the way their life goes, and maybe you're a combination of both.
I think that I'm a combination of both. I teach strategy at the business school at Stanford, so it's not that I'm not strategic in that way, but I'm very much open to opportunity in the context of strategy. I often joke with people, never make me an offer you're not serious about, because I'm likely to say yes. If it's interesting, if it's creative, why not?
Yes.
And so that, I think, has marked my career, and to some extent how I ultimately got into administration, how I became the CEO, and now how I'm a best-selling author of Mistreated.
So let's hop on to Mistreated for a sec here. So take me through the premise of the book and, again, some of the decision or thinking around why this was important to come out and talk about.
So I had been the CEO in the Permanente Medical Group of Kaiser Permanente now for, at that point, probably about 15 years. And I saw all the problems going on in healthcare in general. It was a 19th century cottage industry, fragmented, doctors scattered across the community, hospitals in every town, many of them often redundant, paid on a piecemeal basis. We called it fee-for-service. You saw technology that literally is left over from the last century, and no real leadership structure sitting in play. And I decided that I wanted to write a book because I think there was a better way, a way that you could provide care that was integrated, doctors working together, both horizontally within the same department and vertically, primary care and specialty care. You could pay them in a capitated way so that now they start to value prevention. They start to value avoidance of complications. I thought video. I think 30% of what we do in the doctor's office could be better done on a video. And certainly I came from a medical group that had a very, very strong leadership that allowed people to be coordinated and to achieve the best results. The book itself, however, begins with my father. Wow. My father was an amazing man. He was a World War II, he was a self-made person. His parents were immigrants, worked his way through college and then through dental school. World War II comes along and he joins up and volunteers for the airborne to parachute in enemy lines. He could have stayed behind safely, but instead he volunteers to join. He's captured by the Germans. He leads a daring escape through the forest. Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation.
Yes.
My dad had a hemolytic anemia, and he had to have his spleen taken out. And as you know, and physicians listening in, or the physicians to be listening in know, when your spleen's taken out, you're susceptible to infection, particularly pneumococcus. And there's a great vaccine that's good for it. Except he lived half the year in New York and half the year in Florida. The doctors in New York thought Florida gave it to him. Florida thought New York, primary care, thought specialty care, et cetera, and never got it. Came out to visit my brother, who, by the way, is chairman of anesthesia at Stanford, and spent the nice dinner at my house, went to my brother's house. My brother found him at 5 a.m. on the way to hospital, unresponsive on the floor.
Oh, wow.
4 days in the ICU, unresponsive, 2 weeks in the hospital, and of course the diagnosis, pneumococcal septicemia. One of 200,000 people in the United States that year to die. And every year since then, Sanjay, it hasn't gotten any better. And so that became the piece that sat in play. I looked at the data. The U.S. healthcare system spends 50% more than any other nation, probably twice as much as Canada spends. And yet its results are the 11 industrialized nations at the very bottom. And you ask Americans about the American healthcare system, what do they tell you? It's the best in the world. 76% of people say that. It's not a shred of evidence that it's true. So I wanted to understand this phenomenon. I went into the literature, looked at things like the so-called Stanford prison experiment. Zimbardo takes normal students, volunteers. Half of them get aviator sunglasses and they become the jailers. Half of them get uniforms with a number, they become the jailees.
Yes.
In 48 hours, the jailers are abusing the jailees, making them clean toilets with their bare hands. The jailees are boarding up the doors. Everyone knows it. Everyone's just a student. Within 6 days, the whole experiment ends. And I ask myself, why? How is it that in a certain context, we behave in a certain way? And there's a lot of the research in there, but that's basically the notion. It's not logical. I talk about the fact of doctors who a third of the time, 80 studies, a third of the time, they don't wash their hands between rooms. Every doctor knows what's the number one cause of infection in a hospital-acquired infection? C. diff. It's carried on the hand, the third leading cause of death, and yet doctors don't wash their hands. How's that possible? They're the most caring people because they don't see themselves as capable of carrying. So this is what the book's about. How does the context shape perception and change behavior? And then, therefore, how do you reshape the context? And that's really the theme of the book. Because when you are integrated, when you and I work together is when we find ways to facilitate that care, to facilitate the exchange of expertise. When we're capitated, we look for opportunities for prevention, opportunities around avoiding complications. When we have technology that allows us now to all provide the best care, then we're going to do it. Even if it's a little out of our specialty, we'll still make sure that it happens. And so that was the genesis of the book. And it became a Washington Post bestseller. It's still a bestseller out there, and I think it really resonates with people, not just because of the message and the learning, but because of the personal experience and how many people have that type of personal experience in their lives every single day, at least in the United States. I don't want to say about Canada, but at least in the United States, it's a major issue and a major opportunity.
Yeah, no, you brought up a lot of, I think, really important points. That I think the first is, I mean, I love the fact that you had a personal situation, and I'm very sorry to hear about your father in that situation.
Thank you.
But that you took, something that was a negative experience, and then really thought about it and explored it, and then said, okay, how can we learn from that as collectively, as an organization in the healthcare system and as society. So I think that's a very powerful message, I think, for medical students to hear, because there will always be negative things that happen in our lives, and how you react to that. I mean, like, I guess the sense of creating lemonade out of lemons, I think is always an important thing. And I would also say the second thing is, as a surgeon, the adoption of surgical checklists to be reviewing your process constantly is of just critical importance. And, when I was in business school, we talked a lot about Six Sigma and importing really the process of the aviation industry into the surgical theater. And so, I'm interested to know, again, going back to Mistreated for a second, were there very specific kind of recommendations? And I guess hopping over to your former life as being a CEO, were there kind of a handful or just a few things that you think, if we could make those changes, could have a huge benefit to society in terms of reducing either surgical errors or reducing MRSA or C. diff infections?
I think it's all four pillars, and I think the biggest lesson of the book is you can't pick and choose one versus the other. I always start with the capitation versus fee-for-service. It's interesting to me. I ask people, how many of you would just hire a contractor to redo your kitchen and say, I'll pay you time and materials?
Right.
No one.
Right.
No one says they would do that. And yet that's really what happens in healthcare today.
Mm-hmm.
And if a physician makes a mistake, most of the time, Medicare is a little bit different in the United States, they get paid twice. In fact, there's been some studies showing that hospitals would lose money if they didn't have all the operating room complications. So you start, I also have a business experience teaching the business school at Stanford. What do we learn? Incentives drive behavior. And the incentives of at least the fee-for-service system in the United States are completely broken. As soon as you move from that to capitation, and I don't mean at the insurance level, I mean at the individual practice level, now you start to ask different questions. You ask questions about technology. Why should I bring you in to see me if I can solve your problem with a digital picture or with a video? And more than that, I can solve it immediately. I don't have to solve it tomorrow or the next day, and you don't miss work. But only 1% of doctors in the United States use video as a frequent way of providing care. And now when you're integrated, if primary care works with specialty care, what happens most of the time? The primary care physician, when they send us a referral, sometimes they need an intervention, a procedure. Sometimes they need the receiving physician to do something pretty extensive, but most of the time they want a small piece of information. So why not link people together with the telephone or with the video? Because it doesn't pay in the United States. And again, I don't know as much about the current Canadian system. So as soon as you change all those parts, now you start to change things. And last of all, to me, is leadership. Again, you were in business school. Think of a business that would run without having a structure to it, a coordinating structure, someone to make decisions that are logical for the entire population that you're going to serve around your capital, your hospitals, who's going to decide whether inpatient versus outpatient versus what's best for the patient, not what's going to generate the most revenue. You need to have that structure. And American medicine does not have that. I use it as an example, for instance, in California, where I live most of the time. Between San Jose and San Francisco, there's 10 places doing heart surgery, 50 miles, 10 services. 3 of them do fewer than 300 cases a year. That's less than 1 a day. How good can you be if you do a complex procedure less than once a day? And how efficient can you be when at least 65 days of the year, because it is a 7-day-a-week service, there's no work to be done, but you got to pay people to be there. I often contrast it with a friend of mine named Debbie Shetty. I don't know if you know Debbie Shetty.
I've heard the name, but not personally.
So Debbie's a fascinating man. he's a heart surgeon from India. He trained in the United States and in England. And he runs 11 heart hospitals in India. If you ask Devi, by the way, he was Mother Teresa's physician. So we're talking about a pretty famous guy. Ask Devi, what do you do? Devi will say to you, I set a price on human life. Devi, what do you mean you set a price on human life? He said, every morning I come to the hospital and there's 30 moms with 30 babies. They've all been well worked up. India has a very good diagnostic pediatric system. They all need surgery. And we talk for a little while, but only 10% of people in India have insurance. So 90% of the time, they've got to borrow the money. He does a lot of free surgery, by the way, but he can't do everyone for free. And he tells them what it costs. Right now, it costs $1,800 for cardiac surgery. And results, by the way, are better than any facility I know about in the United States. If they can borrow the money, the child lives. If they can't borrow the money, the child goes home to die. He says, if I get the cost down to $1,500 or $1,200, what children live? I will have elevated the price of the human life. Wow. Now, I tell this story to a lot of people not because of him, Devi in India, because I don't think very many people from Canada or the United States are going to go there. But he's also building a hospital in the Cayman Islands. I don't know if you've ever been to the Grand Cayman Islands. They're beautiful. 1 hour plane ride from Miami. There's 50,000 people on the island. He's building a 2,000 bed hospital. About 12 of those beds are for the people of the Cayman Islands.
Right.
He's going to build it for the people sitting in Florida, or maybe the people sitting in Canada. And the opportunity to do that, to provide care, let's even say it's better quality at half the cost. Now, all of a sudden, the threat is disruption. And so, again, the students listening in, I think that what they have to recognize is the future's not guaranteed, but they can make it because they can create the same kinds of systems. What does he do? He has volume. I visited him one day in India. He has 6 teams. What did they do that day? 37 heart surgeries, including heart transplant. That's how you get really good. I asked him at night what happens. He has this large computer system that says how long did it take between a physician seeing a potentially life-threatening problem, not one that was a cardiac arrest, but maybe a drop in oxygenation, a drop in blood pressure, a significant fever unexpectedly, something that is pretty serious. He says right now it is 8 minutes. I don't know about where it's in Canada. In the United States, it's probably an hour and a half. Yeah. He wants to get down to 6. Wow. Because the faster you intervene, the more quickly you can avoid all the associated problems that happen with hyperperfusion, that happen with inflammation. And so this is the kind of thinking that we need in medicine, and what I hope your show will motivate the students and the residents who are listening in to want to pursue and to want to embrace.
That's I completely agree, for sure. Now, Robbie, just hopping back to, you were a CEO, and then you're at some point you decide, I want to write a book. So take me through some of the thinking, or maybe even, like, I know there's a lot of creative medical students and university students out there who may have a book in them, but maybe they don't have the self-belief that you had. Can you sort of walk us through that process, the internal dialogue that you have when you're making that transition to something that's new?
So I think there's 2 parts that you're raising. I think the first part is the writing of the book, which I wrote to some extent in the context of being CEO, because I felt that part of our mission as a not-for-profit organization, and again, I'm leading an organization that has a budget of $25 billion, is providing care to over 5 million people, both on the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States. So we're talking about a large organization, but a lot of its mission is socially driven, mission driven. And so how do we get the rest of the nation to match our performance? Kaiser Permanente can't be the sole provider of care across the United States. We have to inspire others to do it. So it started coming out of the mission-driven piece of it. I think the interesting part, though, was after I had finished my term, and as believe it or not, there's terms of 6 years each inside the Permanente Medical Group. I think it was a shift then from going from being an author, being a CEO, to being an author, to spending my time. I will have given 100 major keynotes or events. Wow. 2 a week. There are some weeks I do 4 and 5. And it's all in order to promote change. All the profits, by the way, for my book, Mistreated, go to a not-for-profit, Doctors Without Borders. So I don't make any money on that. That's not the driver of doing it. And it has to do with this whole mission-driven spirit. And I think that is something that's in physicians, and it's taken out of them. I think the process, and again, I'm going to speak more about the U.S. because I do think the Canadian system is better. But the U.S. system, they start in medical school, they come out with a huge amount of debt. Everything's about how do you get the highest score in what's called the step one, this exam you take after 2 years so you can get into the right residency. Very competitive process sitting in place. It's not something that promotes humanism. It's something that simply promotes competition, sometimes good, but also, I think, gets people away from why they chose medicine. And that's why burnout is so great sitting
absolutely.
there.
Yeah.
So I'd say to the people there, if you think you have a book inside, you start writing. It's tougher than you think. It probably took me a good 10 hours per page. It took me 5 full writings. Atul Gawande's a friend of mine, and I asked Atul once, who I think is just an incredible author, how many times do you write a book? I don't mean edit it. I mean, rewrite the whole thing. He said 5. So I feel like I was at least on the par in that way, although he's far better than I am at expressing a lot of thoughts. His book, Being Mortal, is fabulous for anyone who has not read it.
He's a wonderful author. Yeah.
But so try writing it. Make sure you have something really important to say. Get other people to read it. And then at some point, you need to get yourself an agent who will then find a publisher. And that's how I went on that process. But the other journey, I think, was even, as I say, even more interesting because I didn't know what would happen. I've been writing a Forbes blog for about 5 years. The one I wrote this week, and I'm not quite sure when this episode is going to air, was about Senator McCain. And Senator McCain, as you know, just died from a glioblastoma.
Yes.
And the headlines on the American media was about how he quit because he refused to have any more chemotherapy. And I wrote a piece talking about he didn't quit. It takes bravery and courage to face reality. How many things do we do that add little value in healthcare? And how often as physicians are we afraid to tell patients the truth? There's not much more I can do. Whatever I do is not going to make any difference. What you really should do is figure out what you most value in life. If you want to do more and more things, I'll do them for you. But if you want to spend time with your family, if you want to have the last days be great days or as good as they can possibly be, then you may want to pick that option. We don't tell patients the truth. We tell them the things that make us feel better. I think that's one of the most important things medical students and residents can learn before they get into their practice.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Now, we were talking just a little bit before we started airing the show about your next book, and we were talking about, how we make decisions, how some of us are very mathematical, and I shared with you that a large part of my research career was creating cost utility models, doing decision analysis, so a very mathematical approach. But as I get older, I make the decisions more from how I sleep at night and how, making a gut feel. So I'm really interested in where you're going with your next book. What are some of the issues you're exploring? And if you've come to some universal truth around how to make a good decision.
So once again, this is the same process that's been with me since college. I like creative things, I like new things. I get fascinated by ideas. And when, let's say, Mistreated was a bestseller on the Washington Post bestseller list for several weeks. It's now a year later, and I'm still speaking about it, but I'm looking at the next horizon. And I'm looking around me and thinking about people I know, because all these people I've met in a medical context. They have these decisions, as I said to you, Sanjay, that are different than the ones you've talked about. If you want to buy a house, again, I don't know in Canada, in the United States, there's a thing called Zillow. And Zillow will tell you the price and a whole lot of information about the house. And you can do a calculation on dollars per square foot. If you want to buy a car, you can go to Consumer Reports. But there's some decisions you can't use those complex, beautiful mathematics that you developed. So in general, at first I was going to call it defining decisions. It's called Defining Decisions. It was going to be on death, life, and sexuality, because that's really the 3 sections that it's about. And they're interviews with 12 people. The death one is a colleague of mine who actually operated on me when I got hit by a car doing volunteer surgery in Mexico. I got hit by a car.
Wow.
I fractured my arm. He had to operate on it. And that wasn't the part I wrote about. I wrote about the end of his life when he did a physician-assisted suicide. He developed ALS prior to that.
Wow.
There's another story about a young girl I know, 17 years old, who had developed 2 cancers one of the brain and one of the colon, unrelated, not the same cancer. Some variant of Lynch syndrome, but it's not Lynch syndrome. And the decisions that she makes and how she won't have her rectum taken out because she doesn't want to have a colostomy bag. How do you make those decisions? There's a set on sexuality. A physician I know very, very well who went transgender from being a male to a female. How do you make that choice? How did she make that choice? And what about her wife who married a man, is now married to a woman? How do you make those choices? You can't put those into a mathematical model. And then the ones on life are really about people who do extraordinary things. Physician who went to medical school blind. Imagine doing a surgery rotation blind. Another physician who went to Liberia to treat people with Ebola. He had to have IVs going into him while he was taking care of the patients because he was so hot inside the suit that was protecting him sitting in play. A medical student, actually, who donated a kidney to a stranger. So how do these decisions get made? And I think if you want, the lessons I have learned is, first of all, these decisions are all consequential. So the ones that are not consequential, we make and forget about. These are ones you can't forget about. They often take a long time to percolate through. They're the decisions that you can't do a mathematical calculation. A committee can't decide. There's no one who's a path you can follow. And I think these are the ones, in the end, we sort of know the right answer, but it takes us a long time to admit it to ourselves. And that's probably the biggest thing that I came up with and how we make it. But even more important than that, so far, what I've come up with is that whatever decision we make is a good one.
Interesting.
Because simply by the fact that it's about 50-50 means that either way it could go. But most importantly, once we make that decision, then we make it be successful. And in that process of making it be successful, we make our choice be the right choice. So that's what I would say to people. When you face these decisions, don't be afraid of them. They're going to turn out okay. Embrace them, choose, and move forward.
Oh, that's great. That's great advice. Now I'm interested. Let's say a 25-year-old medical student presents to you and is asking for life advice. If you have a retrospective, giving everything that you've done, what advice would you give to the next generation of physicians?
It's hard to give it to a whole generation because I do believe that people are different. But to myself, I would probably have recognized that I tend to have passion for things. And so if the student is sitting there with passion for something, go after it, whatever it's going to be. Even if you think it's a residency you can't possibly get, even if it's a place you want to live that doesn't make any sense, or a practice you want to do, you'll figure it out. So that's the first thing that I would say. And the second one I learned from actually a professor of mine, one of the subsequent chairman of the department, a gentleman named Lars Vistas. And I was struggling with this decision whether to basically, I don't want to say give up surgery, but cut back on my surgery in order to become the CEO. It was a very tough choice for me. In defining decisions, I write actually a whole chapter on how I actually made that choice sitting there. And his advice to me is what I would tell the students. He said, windows open and windows close. And when you better be prepared to jump through them when they open, because you never want to find yourself back behind the closed window. We regret more the things that we didn't do than the things that we did.
That's very, very true. I've made a lot of personal changes. I went to grad school twice after doing fellowships in retina, and it's interesting. I just find there's so much change in medicine, and the more education, the more you're open to creative projects, to meeting new people, you never regret that. You just never regret it.
Yeah. I love experiences.
Yeah. A couple of other last questions. Is there a patient, because I'm really big on this, I've had some patients that I've had that have really transformed the way that I look at life. Anything top of mind that comes to a patient that may have said something to you, or an interaction that you had that really may have challenged your framework of thinking, or B, changed the way that you thought about something?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of them I could talk about. One who comes to mind is a woman whose name was Doris. And she was born with a extremely severe hemangioma. Eyelids, cheeks, lips. Her face was swollen out to 2 fistfuls. It was a moderately high flow. It penetrated into all the muscles. You couldn't take it all out. And she came to see me. She had moved to the West Coast, and she came to see me after having probably 10 surgeries on the East Coast and wanting me to take it out. Now, I teach at Stanford. I teach people about making good decisions. And I would caution them, this is a lady who's had 10 surgeries. It's not much you can do. You can't take out all the muscles or you paralyze her face. A little trim, a little there. It's risky. She could bleed. This is a moderate flow type of vascular abnormality. It's foolish to operate. That's what I said to her. And she said, I know, and I'd like you to do it anyway. And so we talked quite a bit. She was starting a import-export business in China and Hong Kong, Singapore. She wasn't a hermit. She had lots of friends. She used every opportunity. She was embracing life, and she was asking me to help her. Not to cure her. She knew nothing much would change, but to go ahead and do a little bit to move her along. And that was I did it in the end. I actually operated about 6 more times. Each time, slight improvement. Never very much, but she needed that to help her to continue to move forward. And I think that was the biggest thing, the narrative. And we're learning that in medicine. I mean, in this book, Defining Decisions, I talk about how, from my perspective, there's sort of 3 moments. We had the 60s and into the 70s when we really didn't know very much. We weren't even sure about the link of lipids with heart disease. We certainly had no tools to diagnose it, nothing really to treat it. Then we got into the scientific era, 80s into the 90s. There's almost nothing we didn't know or couldn't do. We understood the role. We had drugs to take care of the problem. We had stents, we had surgery, you name it. And in that process, we lost something about the patient. We extended life so long, but we lost something about the meaning of life. And I think that when I think back to what's needed, it's the conversations, because she helped me understand. And it'd be easy for the listeners to maybe assume that, all right, this is a story about success. Everyone should be so brave. No, it's foolish what she was doing. She had humiliation. Kids would grab their mother's legs and point at her and stare at her, and yet she was out there. It was not a smart decision, but it was her decision, it's who she was. And in her case, I think the surgery helped her along. So that's one person I think I learned a lot from.
Very interesting. And Finding Decisions, when are we going to be able to get a hold of this and read it? Because it's fascinating. It's really
probably
fascinating.
About a year away. It's about 10 hours a page, and I have a lot of other things that I'm doing right now. But I'm probably about 30-40% of the way through.
Wonderful.
I've done a lot of the interviews. I still have some more interviews to do. I've done a moderate amount of the writing, a lot more writing to do, and it'll shape and it'll change. But that's the direction. And then after that, there'll be something else. I think, again, that to your listeners, they should love life. They should be optimistic. I've been accused of saying that a glass with 2 drops is half full, but that's really what I think about life, that people who want to make things happen, who have the talent, and every one of your listeners, they got into medical school. They're smart. They're driven. They can perform. They have that ability. Don't compromise. Don't cut yourself short. Embrace life, embrace change, embrace the things that want to happen. And I'll guarantee you, when you look back, you'll never regret it.
Well, those are definitely incredibly important words to live by. Dr. Pearl, it's been a tremendous pleasure just learning about the various aspects of your life. Professor, former CEO, best-selling author. You have a tremendous, I think, expertise in really at the macro level, seeing and initiating how healthcare is implemented. But you also have this micro perspective of understanding that it's all about the patients and having that open communication. So it's certainly been a pleasure, and I know that our students will learn a tremendous amount from you. Thanks so much for being on the show.
If they want anything more, by the way, they can go to my website, which is robertpearlmd.com.
Okay.
Or they can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. There's a whole lot of ways they can get a hold of me. But as I say, robertpearlmd.com. It takes you to the website, and there's a lot of information, not just about the book, but about all the different themes and other things that are going on right now.
Perfect. And I will say, when Finding Decisions goes live, definitely let us know, and we'll help raise awareness of the book and have you back on.
Sanjay, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. So everyone, that was just a tremendous insight into someone who's made phenomenal decisions, had a wide perspective. So we're always open to suggestions for how we should be discussing the next guest. We have a number of great guests coming on in the future weeks. Make sure to keep in touch with us, subscribe to the channel, and we definitely want to hear from you. Thanks very much for joining us.